Dawn lifts slow over the Bonito, a pale coin rising on a street that could be any frontier street. One thread of hard earth stitched with adobe and wood. A signboard creaks. A horse nods at the hitch rail, breath ghosting in the chill. Lincoln, New Mexico territory, is only one street wide, but the road runs on forever, east to the rolling prairie and west to the dark shoulders of the Capitans. By sundown, the dust here will taste metallic, and a boy with a slouch hat will begin his walk into legend. Lincoln is not a dot on a map. It is a county seat on a continent-sized stage. A decade earlier, the county sprawled across a quarter of New Mexico, an empire of grass and arroyos and scattered homesteads. To the north and east, the Army rides out of Fort Stanton. To the south, the Mescalero Apache reservation struggles under the weight of federal policy and hunger and change. Where soldiers bivouac and agencies line up their ledgers, beef and flour and credit turn into power. Whoever feeds the fort and the reservation can name a price for everything else. On the shelf of that power stands a name painted in tidy letters across a mercantile front. L.G. Murphy & Co., later James J. Dolan & Co., a company that does not just sell goods, it sells permission to breathe. Store credit, ranch loans, and influence in the courthouse bind men tighter than any rope. On the high plains, winter starves the careless. Debt starves the proud. A man whose tally runs at Murphy's store learns quickly that prices are not numbers. They are levers. In a town where law wears many faces, a probate judge might also be a merchant, and a sheriff might be a customer. Some historians say the mighty Santa Fe ring smiles behind the accounts, a web of lawyers and office holders who pull strings in distant rooms. On paper, that is politics. Out here, it's the difference between an honest brand and a rustler's brand, between a warrant and a funeral. Into this domain, in the autumn of 1876, rides a young Englishman with the careful manners of a shopkeeper and the eyes of a gambler, John Henry Tunstall. Not alone, never alone. With him stands attorney Alexander McSween, quick with wits and strategy, and behind them the long shadow of cattle king John Chisholm, a man who can turn a river of beeves into coin. Their plan is simple and incendiary. Open a rival store and bank, extend credit on terms that don't bite, buy and sell cattle without kissing the ring. On the frontier, that is not competition. That is a declaration. Lincoln's street listens. In the Tunstall store, sacks of flour sit square as sermon benches. Bolts of calico brighten the shelves. Across the way, Dolan's men watch faces that used to cross their threshold veer toward the newcomer's door. When a county has one store, one bank, one hand on the scale, the second hand is treason. Word spreads along the Ruidoso and through the coulees. There's a new way to owe and a new way to pay. The old way takes it personal. This is where the boy comes in, though he is not always a boy and never only a boy. He answers to Henry McCarty, sometimes to Kid Antrim, sometimes to William H. Bonney. But in parlors and bunkhouses and cantinas, the nickname sticks like a burr. Billy. He is light on his feet and fluent in Spanish. He dances, sings, and grins with a mischief that softens the angle of his jaw. He plays Monte with a dealer's grace and slips trouble like a coyote slipping through mesquite. He is also a dead shot, and when he chooses a side, it is the side where his friends ride and his wages come due. In a county of ledgers, loyalty has a balance sheet too. The kid is not the storm, he is the pressure falling. The storm is economic and human, a knot of favors and debts, oaths and grudges. The Army's hunger for beef fattens some fortunes, and the reservation's ration lists turn contracts into pipelines. It's said Murphy and Dolan's reach extends from the counting table to the courthouse. Who gets a license? Who gets a loan? Who gets a hearing? Maybe that's only the way it feels if you owe the wrong man. Maybe it's exactly the way it is. Either way, on the prairie, the difference between rumor and truth is just the interval before someone brings a gun. Tunstall and McSween don't bring guns. They bring paper, liens, filings, and arrangements. Paper is fine until it catches fire. Credit wars turn personal on lonely roads, and branded cattle don't ask who signed the note. Posses start wearing store loyalties like uniforms. Some nights the talk is all about injunctions. Other nights it's who was seen riding with the Jesse Evans gang, or who tipped a hat to the Seven Rivers Warriors. Horse tracks tell stories trailsmen prefer not to read aloud. In this climate, an accusation is the first verse of a ballad, and men reach for the refrain they know best. Tunstall tries to run cattle clean, to keep his ledgers tidy and his hands close. He is not naive. He is new, which is a different danger. He rides with his cowboys, corrects his own tallies, and makes a habit of being seen where his brand is seen. It is a smart habit in a peaceful county. In Lincoln County, it marks a man for those who would make a lesson of him. The winter of 1877 bleeds into the winter of 1878. Hard cold, thin grass. Around the pot-bellied stove in the store, talk tightens like a cinch. Writs filed, debts called, threats as casual as spurs on a chair rung. Across the street, Dolan's side has its own stove and its own talk. The two conversations are a mirror and a fuse. Women trade recipes, men trade stories. Both sides trade looks that say what mouths will not. The feel of the place changes first. The way folks lower their voices when a stranger steps in. The way a rider notices who notes his passing. On February 18, 1878, John Tunstall rides with a few hands to move horses. The day is ordinary the way a day is ordinary until the road drops into a shallow wash and the mesquite closes like a curtain. A posse appears where no one wants a posse. William Morton, Jesse Evans, Tom Hill. Names spoken on both sides of the street. Hard men with a warrant that explains everything and nothing. Shots roll across the flats like thrown stones. When the echoes die, a neat Englishman lies in the dust with his hat beside him, and the wind has a taste of iron. In Lincoln, the news moves faster than horses. Tunstall's down. Even if you're holding a ledger, you hear it like a shot fired through glass. In a single afternoon, the county's tidy quarrel erupts into a shooting war. What begins next will be written as justice by men who carry warrants and as vengeance by men who carry grief. Tunstall's cowboys and allies gather themselves into a company with an official-sounding name, the Regulators, and a private-sounding oath. Find the killers, bring them in, balance the books. Some carry papers signed by justices of the peace. Others carry a memory of their boss's final breath. The law here is a set of forms overlaying a set of loyalties. When those layers slip, the real shape of power shows through. Billy rides with them. Maybe he is seeking a kind of order no court ever offered him. Maybe he is seeking the more honest arithmetic of reprisal. He's young enough to believe that if you run toward danger, danger will see the decency of your courage and blink. He's old enough to know that if it doesn't blink, you shoot first. The boy who jokes in Spanish now speaks in the dry vocabulary of warrants, deputies, and affidavits. The dancer learns to stand still behind an adobe wall until a man with a badge walks past. This is not the stuff of ballads. It is the arithmetic of survival in a county that is learning the language of blood. Across the territory, the telegraph taps. And in Santa Fe, the names move through rooms with braided rugs and cut glass decanters. Some say the Santa Fe ring is watching. Some say they are only names men mutter when they need a shorthand for why justice runs uphill. Whatever the truth, appointments change, letters are drafted, and in Washington, officials consider whether a distant county's quarrel is worth the paper it would take to scold it. Meanwhile, on Lincoln's one street, men load cartridges and turn their hats brim down on table corners. At twilight, the street looks innocent again. Children counting steps between doorways. A mule dozing in front of the Ellis store. That is the slyness of Lincoln. Serenity is only the intermission between acts in which the same actors wear different faces. In this half-light, you can believe the feud will slow, that writs and handshakes will right the balances. Then a door opens. Two men pause on a porch that faces the wide street. One glances down to a pair of worn boots, the other to a badge whose shine is a dare. They don't know it, but history is coiling around them like a lariat, drawing them toward April and a volley behind an adobe wall. For now, breath fogs once in the cooling air and vanishes. Night keeps its counsel. The wind shifts. Somewhere beyond town, coyotes begin to sing. Before the month is out, riders will be choosing which doorway to duck behind when the law passes. Before summer, an entire house will be ringed and fired. Before the year ends, letters will cross the desert promising peace that never quite arrives. But tonight, Lincoln sleeps. On a shelf in the Tunstall store, account books rest with their cords tied neat. Across the way, another ledger sits open to a page that will be torn out later, when the numbers prove too loud. And in a rented room not far from either door, A boy checks the action on a Winchester, humming a tune he learned in a Spanish kitchen. If you asked him what song it is, he might grin and say it's just something to keep his hands from shaking. Morning will put him in the saddle. By then, the county will already be sliding toward a mathematics that paper cannot solve. Each shot fired will be an entry, each body a sum. And when the dust finally settles, folks will argue over who balanced the books and who burned them. For now, there is only the hush before a match is struck. The fragile beauty of a town unaware it is about to become a cautionary tale. Tomorrow the arithmetic begins. They said John Tunstall rode tidy even on a working day. Hat square, coat brushed, the neatness of a man who believed order could be brought to wild country by ledger lines and steady hands. The morning of February 18th, 1878, the sky over the Bonito had that polished, pewter look it gets before wind. Tunstall and a few of his men, Brewer, Middleton, Waite, perhaps the kid himself riding a little off, were easing a string of horses toward town when the wash narrowed and the mesquite grew teeth. The posse waited there, iron quiet. Someone called a halt. Someone else raised a rifle. The shots fell flat and hard, and when silence returned, it had edges. In the dust lay the Englishman who'd refused to kneel to the old monopoly. Word flew for Lincoln like a swallowed oath. Tunstall is down, and by nightfall grief had a shape and a list of names. The murder would become the spark, and every man with an account in either store felt the tinder in his own lungs catch. Grief on the frontier does not sit well. It stands, buckles on leather, and looks for the men who did the thing. At Squire John Wilson's desk, with pen and seal and the brittle dignity of territorial forms, Tunstall's hands and friends were sworn as special constables, a legal fiction that felt like justice. They called themselves the Regulators, put Richard Dick Brewer at their head, and pinned warrants beside their hearts as if paper could stop a bullet. Their ironclad corps rode light and mean. McCarty, Billy, Scurlock, Boger, Frank and George Coe, Jim French, Chavez y Chavez, Henry Brown, Fred Waite, and more. They were, on any given day, both the law and the men the law wanted. In Lincoln County that spring, those roles were often separated only by who reached the judge first. The road out of Lincoln coiled with rumor. One posse carried warrants from the courthouse, another carried grief's arithmetic, one life for one life with interest. William Morton and Frank Baker were taken on a cold March day. The story says they tried to run and were shot down in flight. Those stories have a way of fitting the teller's need. Coffins multiplied faster than verdicts, and respectable men learned to keep two vocabularies, the one for Sunday and the one for when a horse blew in at a lope and someone needed saddling. The question was no longer who is right, but who is ours. And that is the question that turns a county into a camp. On April 1st, when the cottonwoods on the Rio Bonito first show their green, Sheriff William J. Brady and his men stepped into Lincoln's long street. The day was clean, the light indifferent. Half the town knew where the Regulators were. The other half pretended not to. Behind an adobe wall, rifles waited with the still patience of men who have timed another man's stride. Brady reached the kill zone. The volley broke like a plank under weight. The sheriff dropped, and with him fell a certainty the county had clung to, that titles and badges could still anchor the drift of things. To some, Brady had been a hand on Murphy and Dolan's scale. To others, he was the last, thin reed of order. However you kept your books, the street said only this: the law bled on the dust. What followed felt less like days passing than like a fever. Sudden flushes of heat, then lulls when a man could hear his own watch tick. Riders came hard out of the Seven Rivers country, that dry web of draws where small ranchers had long resented John Chisholm's herds rolling past like river water. They called themselves Seven Rivers Warriors, sometimes riding with the Jesse Evans gang, sometimes with the John Kinney outfit, often wearing deputy stars as if law were a costume to be tried on and discarded at will. The alliances changed by the week, but the business end of a Winchester looked the same. Under the dust of affiliation, the conflict was still about who set prices for beef, who extended credit, who wrote the IOUs that bent a man's back. Fate, or the part of fate that enjoys bad timing, sent a single stubborn buffalo hunter into the teeth of all this: Andrew L. Buckshot Roberts. April 4th, Blazer's Mill, a sawmill and trading post perched above the Tularosa, with a restaurant that smelled of flour and coffee and wood smoke. The regulators were there, hot with warrants and the righteousness of the newly deputized. Roberts, wounded before and cranky by temperament, wanted nothing to do with any range war. He came to collect pay he believed was due. Then a face recognized a face, and the small room narrowed like the wash where Tunstall fell. Guns cleared leather. What followed was the kind of stuttering, close-quarters fight that ends legends or makes them. Brewer trying to flank, Roberts braced behind a door jamb. Men trying to haul the old hunter out of the open and getting led for their trouble. By noon, the place was a butcher's geometry of angles and cover. Dick Brewer lay dead by the ditch. Roberts was mortally hurt. No ballad can keep its meter in such a cramped, ugly fight, but men would sing of it anyway. Lincoln cracked along household seams. Women who once traded recipes now traded glances over the shoulders of their children, counting which men walked with which men. Letters went north to Santa Fe like bottled messages down a flood. Affidavits, petitions, pleas. The telegraph tapped its metallic gossip to newspapers that had never smelled New Mexico dust, and Eastern readers took sides on kitchen tables while the wind pushed grit under doors in Lincoln. You could tell a man's faction by where he bought nails, by which door he chose when two saloons beckoned across the same plank sidewalk. In that climate, neutrality looked like cowardice and prudence like betrayal. Every handshake was a ledger entry with a due date. Even so, the language of law clung to the quarrel like a last wet leaf. Warrants were served at gunpoint. Affidavits were sworn with blood on the floorboards. Someone would spend a morning writing up an indictment and the afternoon digging a grave. A deputy's badge might get you a discount on beans in one store and a bullet from the window of the other. Meanwhile, Billy, quick to laugh, quicker to slip away, was learning the calculus of survival in a county that treated adolescence as a luxury. He had friends on the right side, but he could also order breakfast in Spanish on a side street without drawing notice, and that was its own kind of amnesty. It is tempting to say this was chaos, but chaos does not balance accounts. Men do. With Tunstall dead and Brady down, each faction totted up its injuries and chose its next payment. For Murphy and Dolan's adherents, that meant dragging the law like a net through their enemies' yards. For the Tunstall-McSween side, it meant holding fast to their makeshift, paper-thin authority as regulators and insisting, sometimes with a straight face, that a gun in a good cause is only a pen that writes faster. Behind the badges and warrants hovered bigger shadows, the Santa Fe ring, federal contract, the undertow of the Army's demand for beef, that pulled the local quarrel into deeper water than any single rider could sound with a stick. The county's tragedy was not that bad men chose violence. It was that decent men found they could no longer tell the difference between violence and self-defense. By early summer, the lines were no longer shifting. They were dug. Men slept with their boots on. Horses were kept saddled in shaded alleys. A boy walking an errand knew to hug walls at corners, and a woman crossing the street kept her parcel tucked tight, as if that could make her small enough to miss. The kid carried himself like weather, genial one hour, hard as flint the next. Whether you called him Henry, Billy, or Bonnie depended on what story you wanted to tell later. He would oblige you either way, because that is what legend does. It steps into the outline you draw and fills it with gun smoke. What no one could do, not sheriff, nor squire, nor storekeeper, was stop the county from sliding toward its trial by fire. The spring had taught Lincoln that killing did not settle debts. It multiplied them. Each body laid out under a blanket drew another man to hitch his belt tighter and borrow another cartridge belt on credit. The town's one street had become a corridor, with doors barred on both sides and a question yawning at the far end. When the reckoning comes, will it be a verdict or a bonfire? The answer in July would be both. But in April, you could still stand in Lincoln at sunset and believe, briefly, that nothing worse would happen than what had already happened. The store lamps came up, yellow and stubborn. A lone fiddle leaked out of a back room. Somewhere beyond sight, downriver toward the mill and the scattered ranches, a man in a blood-stiff shirt tried to wash his hands and found the stain refused him. In that refusal lay the truth that everyone in Lincoln was already learning in their bones. Once blood and dust mix, there is no clean separation again, only the slow settling that follows a storm, and the quiet in which men stack ammunition by lamplight. By July, the heat had a personality, mean as a cornered steer and just as stubborn. The cottonwoods along the Bonito hung their leaves like tongues. Lincoln's one street glittered with ground glass, bottle shards and mica dust, all the broken sparkle of a town that had forgotten how to be unafraid. The factions had finished choosing. Men slept with boots on, rifles near, and a last prayer tucked between their teeth. When the riders came in on July 15, they did not come to warn or parley. They came to pen their enemies in place and to let patience, powder, and hunger do the rest. A map of the street that week looks simple until you understand what walls can do to a man's courage. On the west end stood the Tunstall store, thick-walled and stubborn. Farther along, the Ellis store, good for looking down a barrel across the street. On a lot not far away, the rambling McSween house, part adobe, part timber, with doors that opened onto a yard where children had once practiced running without tripping. The Dolan faction, augmented by Seven Rivers riders and old hands who liked their credit steady, moved to surround those points, a patient tightening of a noose. Inside the buildings, regulators took their places. Jim French, Charlie Beaudre, George and Frank Coe, John Middleton, Fred Waite, Chavez y Chavez. The kid himself among them at one time or another, crossing alleys under fire, ferrying cartridges through doorways that had ceased to be thresholds and become ideas of safety. The siege began in whispers and settled into a rhythm of shots so spaced you could tell time by them. Men cut rifle ports through adobe with knives and the heels of their hands, loopholes they called them, and learned which cracks in which walls matched which stretch of street. Step into sunlight without thinking, and the day would correct you. A man's world shrank to the width of a rifle sight and the patience of waiting for another man's silhouette to reappear. Dust sat on tongues and turned talk to the soft syllables of thirst. Somewhere in the McSween house, Susan McSween parceled water with the care of a banker counting out his last coin, shooing children into corners between volleys, and reminding men, gently, fiercely, that she would not allow panic to live under her roof. The first day was all testing, angles, distances, nerves. By the second, the town had learned the etiquette of a siege. Women carried bread under shawls. Boys skittered low to fetch a message, legs pumping like colts. On porches, neighbors who had shared coffee 2 winters running now kept the sort of eye on one another that a man keeps on a rattler. There were calls to surrender and the hard-breathed laughter those calls draw when both sides believe, with equal conviction, that they are the ones with a reason to hold. The kid moved where he was needed, easy where others were tight, quick with a joke that bought a friend 10 seconds to reload. He did not walk like a hero. He walked like a young man who has learned the trick of moving between raindrops. On the third day, a new color entered the canvas. Blue. Soldiers from Fort Stanton appeared under Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dudley, their uniforms a straight line against Lincoln's crooked horizon. Officially, they were there to protect government property and keep civilians from being ground between gears. Unofficially, history keeps arguing about whether their presence steadied the street or tipped the scales. The Army's arrival changed the air even before it changed the terms. Faces at loopholes studied epaulets over front sights, calculating who would flinch first when federal order brushed against territorial disorder. Men on both sides cursed under their breath, for opposite reasons, which is a kind of agreement. By the fourth day, talk had thinned to hand signs. Smoke cured everyone's lungs the same brown. In the McSween house, floors swept every morning now wore a gritty film, and the rooms had the makeshift order of a church-turned-hospital. Mattresses dragged to safer corners, a table shoved into service as barricade, a basin that used to bathe a child now dark with wash water a man had spit blood into. The regulators inside, McSween himself among them, unarmed by principle and stubborn by nature, watched the sun's track as if it could be bargained with. If they could hold until night, maybe the circle would loosen. If they could hold until tomorrow, maybe the governor's word, someone's word, would find them. The arithmetic of hope is always a little slippery. At dusk that fourth day, the circle did not loosen. It tightened, and then it caught fire. Flames began where a door jamb kissed kindling. In the way of fire, it took what it was given and asked for more. Window light turned the color of bad whiskey. Smoke leaked from the vigas like a secret. Inside, the heat rearranged priorities. Men who had been thinking in angles began thinking in routes. Back door, side yard, the narrow slot between house and fence that might carry a man as far as the cottonwoods if the night would only hurry its feet. Susan McSween, face streaked, gathered women and children and moved them through the paling smoke with a schoolteacher's efficiency and a general's eye for opportunity. Somewhere close, bullets still stitched the adobe, but the sound had changed. It was buffered now, as if the house itself were trying to hold them all one more hour. Then came July 19th, gray and hot at once. The roof cracked. The groan of beams giving up is like a man you love clearing his throat to say something you don't want to hear. The room brightened in a way no room should brighten, and whatever arguments lived inside the men had to finish faster. If a house has a soul, the McSween house set its jaw and let its people choose. They split one cluster, Billy among them, made for the door that opened toward the backyard in the thin cover of smoke and cottonwood trunks. McSween and others hesitated, by conviction, by duty, by the plain fact that a cipher of papers and accounts and principles had been built under this roof, and he could not yet believe that everything he had argued for would be tested by the sprint of a single breath. The breakout was neither clean nor gallant. It was a scramble through a light that burned and a sound that clawed. Men went in batches, 3, 5, 2, diving behind the low garden wall, rolling into a wash of smoke that hid and betrayed in the same instant. Shouts multiplied, human and inhuman both. In the garden, amid the heat-swollen smell of adobe and singed rosebush, McSween fell, a pause, a lurch, and the end of a sentence a year in the writing. Harvey Morris, his young law clerk, went down near him. A bookman killed in a place where the only punctuation that mattered was the stop a bullet provided. The garden kept their shapes like a bed remembers the asleep long after the waking. On the far side of that yard, under cover of confusion, they had purchased with courage and smoke. The kid and a knot of regulators blasted a path and were gone. Into cottonwoods, into draws that know how to fold a rider into themselves. Into country that offers its own kind of amnesty to the fast and the lucky. Lincoln exhaled in the way a town does when the worst part of a story is over. But the worst part of understanding has just begun. The fire ate what it could. The soldiers, their orders both narrow and elastic, kept to the letter of their instructions or the spirit of their sympathies, depending on who told the tale later. When the shooting thinned to sporadic echoes and the smoke learned to rise instead of cling, the street revealed itself, still one street, but altered the way a face is altered after a fever. What had the 5 days proven? That patience is a weapon and so is thirst. That adobe can be asked to do a very adult job. That promises signed in Santa Fe do not put out fires in Lincoln. That a woman with a basin and a will is the equal of any man with a badge and a grudge. Most of all, they proved that victory in a range war is a word you have to define before you use it. The Dolan side could say they had broken the McSween stronghold and scattered the regulators. The regulators could say they had survived a trap meant to kill them to a man and carried their cause into the brush. Both could be right and still be ruined. By sundown on the 19th, the town was quiet the way a church is quiet after a funeral. Boots left prints in ash. Windows stared, black and unashamed. In courtyards, voices tried out the gentler verbs again. Fetch, mend, rest. Finding them too light for the day's work and using them anyway. Because someone must. In that hush, legend did what legend always does. Stepped lightly into the space left by the dead, put a finger to its lips, and began rewriting the balances in ink that would not fade. The law would come next with its letters and caveats, a governor's smile and a bargain offered in a dark room. For now the town learned a single lesson as old as war. When a house burns, it is not only timber that turns to smoke. It is hope and conviction, and the sense that tomorrow will look like today if only you keep your head down. Lincoln looked up and knew better. After the fire, Lincoln tried to remember ordinary things, sweeping ash from thresholds, setting bread to rise, rehanging doors that no longer fit their frames. The garden where McSween fell turned back to dirt and chores because that is what the living do with a battlefield. Women mended shirts with hands that still shook. Men who had stood at loopholes took to scanning the ridgeline the way you study a fever chart, watching for a break that never quite comes. Word drifted up the street that G. Murphy, the grand old name over the monopoly's door, had died of cancer in the autumn that followed the siege, a king laid low by a quieter enemy than a Winchester. Some said his passing would let the quarrel cool. In Lincoln County, the death of a man rarely killed his system. The territory sent a new kind of weather. Lew Wallace arrived in Santa Fe at the end of September 1878, a Civil War general with a novelist's patience for tangled characters. He came to a country still smelling of powder and handled in whispers by the Santa Fe Ring, that loose fraternity of lawyers and patrons whose signatures could change a man's title faster than a jury ever could. Wallace studied the files, met the factions, and began to imagine peace not as a sermon, but as a bargain. In November, he proclaimed a general amnesty for those who had fought, except for men already under indictment. From the palace to the far ranches, men read the proclamation like weather. Good news in theory. In practice, it left the most notorious and most hunted outside the tent, including the youth who had walked out of a burning house and into myth. Billy understood arithmetic. The amnesty did not include him, indicted in the Brady killing, entangled in federal trouble from Blazer's Mill. On Lincoln Street, that was the kind of technicality that could be discussed over coffee. On the prairie, it was a difference that could end a life. He kept riding, a local fighter who had been written up in distant newspapers as a species of demon, which is a kind of safety and a kind of trap. He was weary of running and too young to be comfortable at any table that required both hands. He needed a door that opened inward. Then came a killing that made even the hard men lower their voices. On February 18, 1879, a bad anniversary for Lincoln, Houston Chapman, the attorney hired by Susan McSween to pursue justice, was shot down in the street, his coat catching fire as if the town itself had decided to burn one more time. The names whispered around his murder brought old grins back to the surface. Jesse Evans, Billy Campbell, and with them the certainty that the county would tip again into the fever. Wallace, 50-odd miles and a world away, registered the murder not as gossip, but as a fact that could restart a war he had come west to end. That is when the boy with 100 names reached for paper. In March, Billy wrote to Governor Wallace, the hand on the page surer than the life it described. He offered this: I will testify to what I saw in the Chapman killing, if I can be protected from my enemies and exempted from the prosecutions that still shadow me. It was not a romantic gesture. It was the grown calculation of a young man who had learned that New Mexico paper, when honored, can move mountains. Wallace wrote back with the sentence that would haunt history. He had the authority to exempt you from prosecution if the kid would tell what he knew. And because real bargains in Lincoln could not stand daylight, they met in secret. One tells it as a lamplit, whispered appointment arranged like contraband. Another as a quiet conversation in a room where both men chose their words like men who understood that language is a loaded thing. The plan, simple as a snare, required performance from both sides. Wallace would arrange a fake arrest to shield the kid from reprisal until he could testify before the grand jury. Afterward, the exemption, the practical man's version of a pardon, would smooth the way to ordinary life. In April, Billy kept his half. He stood up and told what he had seen, adding his voice to the territory's effort to name and charge the men whose violence had kept Lincoln off balance for 2 hard years. In the courtroom, he was not an outlaw but a witness, and in any decent world, that change of noun would have changed his fate. But a county is not a decent world. It is a network. Local politics snapped the thread Wallace had tried to stretch between law and mercy. A district attorney with his own mathematics refused to honor the bargain. The grand promises of Santa Fe went quiet in the one room where a signature mattered. The kid did not walk free. He waited weeks in custody that felt to him less like protection than like a pen with the gate left open, just enough to make hope cruel. When the papers did not come and the air thinned, he slipped the corral and rode back into the only landscape that had ever kept him alive. Motion, back roads, faces he trusted because they'd been beside him under fire. The governor's office would later say he had not held to the terms. The kid would say there were no terms left to hold. Both sentences were true inside the mouths that spoke them. Around them, men kept accounts. The ring minded its clients. Merchants minded their ledgers. Ranchers minded their herds and their hired guns. In rooms with shutters half closed against the sun, lawyers adjusted language until it served the hands that fed them. New Mexico in the late Gilded Age was less a wilderness than a diagram of patronage, with each line deeding someone the right to say who owed what. Wallace had come west to put a frame around all that and call it order. His proclamation had calmed the air. Yes, but only for those with clean dockets. For the boy who had outlived a burning house and a battlefield, the future remained a contested road. There is a temptation to declare that if Wallace had signed one more paper, the legend would have unspooled differently. Perhaps. But amnesties in New Mexico did not work like hymns. They work like contracts, and contracts fail when any single pen refuses to move. The Chapman testimony had done what government hoped. It enabled charges against men embedded in the county's old machinery. Yet no cavalry came for the witness when the machinery turned to face him. In the kitchen talk along the Bonito, people said it proved what they already knew. Justice here traveled in company. A man alone could not hire it. Through that spring and into 1880, Billy became exactly what politics makes when it cannot make peace. A problem with a heartbeat. Ranchers called him a rustler when cattle went missing. Old enemies called him an assassin. Friends still saw the boy who danced and borrowed songs in Spanish kitchens. Newspapers far away, hungry for a poster, painted him in primary colors. Cold-blooded killer, frontier Robin Hood, whatever would sell a headline. He went on living in the gray, which is the only color the living get. As for Susan McSween, she kept ranching, a widow turning nerve and remnant assets into a legal empire of her own, stone by stone, deed by deed, proving that not every victory in Lincoln needed a rifle to announce itself. As for the governor, he finished a book in his palace rooms, Ben-Hur, a story about vengeance and redemption, and sent it east on the same rail that had ferried him west. Sometimes the world corrects a man's destiny, sometimes it offers him two at once and asks him to pick the one he wishes to be remembered for. The bargain in the shadows left both men marked. Wallace would carry the criticism of a promise unfinished. Billy would carry the consequence of a promise unredeemed. In the arithmetic of legend, that is more potent than any signed parchment. It is also a poor way to keep a young man breathing. The territories have always preferred stories to systems. Lincoln County made its choice and kept writing. Soon enough, a judge would pronounce a date and a rope. Before that, the kid would stage one more defiance in a building that knew him too well. And far downriver, a house at Fort Sumner would hold a lamp against a summer night while two men considered the cost of finishing what none of the papers had managed to settle. The amnesty had been meant to teach New Mexico how to stop shooting. Instead, it taught a legend how to walk out of a promise and into the dark. Fast, light, and almost smiling, as if even failure could be made to look like freedom from the right angle. Winter took the kid the way winter takes cattle, slowly with a patience that looks like mercy until it isn't. In December of 1880, a gray dawn outside a place called Stinking Springs found him ringed by Pat Garrett and a cordon of men with no appetite for heroics, only for an end. Cold seeped into boot leather and bone. A horse shot from under a rider turned the air to steam and panic. Then it was over in the untheatrical way arrests usually are. The newspapers called it a triumph of law. The men who'd ridden all night called it getting the job done. The boy they took into Santa Fe custody looked smaller with his hat off, which is how jails prefer their prisoners. They kept him there through the turn of the year, iron replacing the speed that had once been his insurance. The cell taught him the arithmetic of days. Bars times hours equals a mind that must be kept occupied. He charmed guards and lawyers because charm is a tool as good as any file. He played at cards with a prisoner's bluff, aware that luck had already been more generous to him than to most. The territory, tired to the marrow of Lincoln County's math, determined to try him away from the county where every juror's purse and conscience were entangled with someone else's. So they trundled him south to Mesilla, where the air is sharper and the courts sit with their backs to the river and their faces to the business of calling things by their proper names. The trial for the killing of Sheriff William Brady did not hold 1,000 surprises. The territory's lawyers peeled the past into statements, affidavits, and testimonies like a man separates a strip of jerked beef. The defense tried to comb chaos into a shape the law could forgive. Witnesses remembered at convenient angles. Some insisted the volley had been a righteous answer to a crooked badge. Others swore it was murder with a store ledger, standing just out of frame. The judge wore the look of a man paid to believe that language can domesticate gunsmoke. In April 1881, A verdict fell the way roofs fall once their beams are burned through. Guilty. The court pronounced a sentence that had been waiting, like a well-oiled machine. The hangman would work in Lincoln on May 13th, sometime between 9 and 3. And the boy they called Billy would go from a noun to a past tense. If fate has a sense of theater, she keeps it dry. Two deputies, James W. Bell and Robert Bob Ollinger, hauled Billy back to the old Murphy store in Lincoln, now a courthouse with a gallows imagined into its second-floor windows. They locked him in a room up the stairs, its pine boards worn thin by boots and worry, a pair of irons at his ankles, a daily shuffle to the privy, the long afternoons when a man and his thoughts discover whether they can abide one another. Ollinger treated him with a bully's humor, parading a 10-gauge shotgun he called the Doozer, loaded heavy with buckshot, and telling anyone within earshot how satisfying justice was about to be. Bell, younger, carried duty lightly, like a jacket he wasn't yet sure how to wear. Townsfolk drifted by on errands to nowhere, catching a glimpse of the famous boy in a second-story window. Not a demon, just a slim figure with hair that wouldn't lie down and a mouth that still tried to find a grin, in a place where grins went to die. The days thinned. The Wortley Hotel across the way served plates nobody finished. A scaffold was discussed in the hushed tones of practical men who would rather talk lumber than souls. The kid who had once slipped through lines of riflemen in a burning yard now measured the hallway and boards and the stair and risers. He asked to use the privy because men still asked for small dignities, even when the big ones have fled. On the way back up, April 28th, the day held out a hand and he took it. Accounts differ on whether he had palmed a hidden pistol or wrested one free, but the small landing exploded into violence. Deputy Bell stumbled back with a bullet in him, his last steps a blind man's reach toward the sun. The shot cracked up the stairwell and out into the street like a town rumor finally finding its voice. Across the way where he'd walked other prisoners to their dinner, Ollinger heard the report and came striding back with the confidence of a man certain his shotgun promised the shape of every encounter. He hit the boardwalk at a trot, boots clacking the way a gavel does when a judge has had enough. Meanwhile, on the courthouse's second floor, the prisoner moved with deliberate speed. He knew the building, the south window that laughed at the street, the stair treads that carried sound too well, the corner where your shadow betrays you in afternoon light. He found Ollinger's precious 10-gauge. The man had left it behind, trusting the iron on the boy's ankles to be enough security, and broke it open with the affection a carpenter reserves for a good tool. The street fell into one of those silences towns remember for generations, the instant before consequence. When Ollinger stepped into the yard and looked up, he saw the figure everyone had been watching for weeks, but altered. Not a prisoner, not yet a ghost, just a young man at a window holding the future across an oak sash. Legend supplies lines for moments like this. Some swear the kid called, "Hello, Bob." Others give him the gallows wit of, "There's your meat," a frontier benediction with a cruel amen. However he shaped the air, the shotgun spoke next, both barrels at breathing range, recoil slamming history into a new groove. Ollinger collapsed into the dust he'd salted with his laughter. The echo ran the length of the street and up into the hills like a warning the county had heard before and never heeded. What came after was as audacious as the shot and twice as practical. The kid set about freeing himself of irons with tools fetched at gunpoint, picks and hammers from downstairs, working with the concentration of a man who knows how briefly the world pauses for disbelief. He found a Winchester and cartridges because he'd never met a pause he didn't want to lengthen. From the window he called down to a cluster of onlookers, ordering one to fetch a horse with a politeness edged in steel. He broke into laughter now and then, not from cruelty, but from the relief of a man discovering that his body still belonged to him. He kept people moving. "You, bring the saddle. You, step back. You, tell anyone who'll listen that if they raise a hand to a rifle, he'll shoot it to rags." The second floor, moments before a gallows waiting room, became a command post, the way any room becomes what the boldest man in it needs it to be. They say he spent near an hour inside the courthouse after the shooting, time enough to finish the delicate labor at his ankles, to collect his breath in the towns, to render decisions about which hat and which horse a man escaping ought to prefer. He moved through the building like a host tidying up after a disagreeable party, closing doors, checking a drawer, leaving behind a ghost of a grin that would be seen years later in other young men who had read about this day in cheap paperbacks. When at last he clattered into the street and swung into the saddle, the chain still swung from one ankle like a mocking spur. He turned the horse as if into a dance step, took the length of the main street at an amble that insulted the idea of pursuit, and rode east under a sky that had kept his secrets before. Someone claimed he was whistling a habanera he liked. Someone else heard only the scuff of iron against stirrup, keeping time. Afterward, Lincoln discovered the luxury of clarity. On the stair, a bullet hole the size of a little finger made history tactile. Boys tested it with a stick, men with the pads of their fingers, as if the past might still be soft to the touch. The window where Ollinger took his last look became a kind of reluctant shrine. Mothers who had praised the law all their lives began to admit, behind closed doors, that the boy had a hunter's nerve and a fox's wit. Men who'd called him devil now tried the word legend in their mouths to see if it fought them. Garrett, miles away and not as surprised as he led on, saddled to ride a new kind of chase, not across open country where tracks hold, but through towns that had begun to prefer the story to the man. The law had expected to close the book with a tidy final chapter: rope, drop, dust. Instead, the book learned how to turn its own page. The kid's escape didn't simply humiliate a sheriff's office, it reshaped the plot, recasting a condemned prisoner as an actor too interesting to kill before the third act. Between Lincoln and the Pecos, there runs a current of forgiveness reserved for the quick and the charming, for those who tip a hat even as they break your rules. He had tipped his hat. He had broken their rules. And now the trail, always the true courtroom of the West, waited with its usual patience to see whether belief or bullets would catch him first. Night would have its say at Fort Sumner. Not yet. For a handful of days that felt, depending on whether you liked him, either like a reprieve or a taunt, the kid rode with irons freshly beaten, a shotgun's smoke still clinging to his sleeves, and the kind of laughter that comes when a man steals back time he'd already been forced to surrender. In that laughter, New Mexico heard the oldest argument it knows: whether law is a set of tools carried by men or a story strong enough to carry them. The answer, as ever, would be decided in a dark room with a single lamp and a man whose patience had finally found the hour it was made for. Dusk at Fort Sumner has its own grammar. Wind skimming low over the Pecos, cottonwoods whispering, the ranch houses along the old parade ground settling into silhouettes. Men sit with their backs to adobe and talk in half sentences. Somewhere a guitar threads a tune through screen doors and mosquito hum. In that thin, almost merciful light of mid-July, Pat Garrett rode in with two deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney, carrying not only warrants and weariness, but the knowledge that the country itself expected an ending. He had buried friends and seen newspaper woodcuts turn a local gunman into a creature of headlines. What matters most on a hunt isn't courage, it's patience. Garrett had more of that than anyone liked. The town was a geography of memory for the kid. Pete Maxwell's long, low house, the store where he liked to talk beef and cornmeal, the corrals where voices slipped easily between Spanish and English. He didn't vanish here. He blended. He still danced, still laughed, still swapped jokes with kitchen women who had fed him during good months and hid him during bad. He had ridden out of Lincoln with irons biting his ankle and the taste of gun smoke braided into his shirt. Now he rode among people who knew his first name and saw the tired in the corners of his eyes. Garrett put Poe and McKinney on the watch. Dark figures between houses, a few murmured questions to men in sombreros leaning against door jambs. He took himself into Maxwell's room, a space that smelled of sweat and lamp oil, with a bed that sagged in the middle and a patch of dark where the plaster had never bothered to be perfect. He waited. Waiting is a kind of prayer, and Garrett was a practical man. He prayed with his jaw set. Out in the yards, the evening played its familiar games. Dogs drifted and sniffed. A woman poured dishwater and listened longer than the chore required. A pair of riders traded low talk by the corral rails. The kid moved among them like weather, not hiding so much as choosing where not to be seen. Stories say he had come for meat, for word, for the ordinary errands that, if you are lucky, keep danger at bay by making it seem ridiculous. He had his habitual knife and the reflex to move first, talk second. He had the confidence of a man who knows a place has loved him. Then a figure in the dark caught his eye. Poe, tall and unfamiliar to him. Words snapped in Spanish, a challenge as old as suspicion. The stranger's hand lifted, and instinct did what years of argument had failed to do. It simplified the world. The kid slid toward the house where Maxwell slept and where, without his knowing, Garrett waited with his thumb on the latch that separates history from everything that leads to it. Inside, the room was ungenerous. Maxwell, roused, was a shape on a bed. Garrett, all intention, pressed himself into the corner until the shadow was a second skin. The door sighed. The kid stepped across a threshold that had fed him many nights. What happened next refuses to sit still, even in the presence of men who swore they saw it. One version says the kid whispered, "¿Quién es?" Who's there? Another insists the words were swallowed by the lamplight. Some tell it like this. A figure by the bed muttered a name. The kid took a half step and turned. Garrett raised his revolver and fired once into the black at close breath. Others, adding a second report, say Garrett fired again as the body folded. There was a knife in the kid's hand, if you want to believe a hunter was met at hunting range. There was nothing at all if you prefer the elegy that innocence always tempts from us after midnight. He hit the floor the way a door hits. Hard, final. The room changed by the sound. 21, if you counted in the generous way friends count years for boys they love. Older than that in hours and in the arithmetic of fear he had survived. Maxwell's walls, used to keeping cows and weather at their proper distances, met an event they could not hold. Poe and McKinney shouldered past each other into the frame. Maxwell sat up and tried to find a sentence with enough air in it. Garrett stood as men stand when their work is both finished and about to begin. The posture of the aftermath. They laid him out by lamplight, smoothing hair that never lay as it ought, straightening a sleeve that had once charmed a kitchen full of laughter. Someone fetched a blanket. Someone else sent a boy for a priest. The news ran ahead of the horse, as it always does. By morning, the house was part wake, part courtroom. Women looked at the face and saw the boy who had danced. Men looked at the stillness and saw the ledger settling itself at last. Children peered, were shooed away, and then peered again from behind a chair leg, memorizing the shape myth makes when it is new. The burial was plain and sufficient. Old Fort Sumner Cemetery had already taken Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Beaudreau, friends who had ridden out their share of speed and luck the winter before. The preacher's words were as thin as the wind. It didn't matter. Dust kept doing its work, filling seams, softening edges, making uniform what had been unruly. Close by, the Picas slid past, indifferent, a ribbon that has seen more stories than any of us will be granted. If you prefer your endings clean, you can stop here. Outlaw down, sheriff upright, the territory a little safer for commerce and sleep. But stories on the frontier are bad at staying put. Pat Garrett went home to write a book, The Authentic Life of Billy, the Kid, with a newspaperman's hand and a politician's need to shape the memory into something that would hold in courts of talk as well as law. Eastern papers rejoiced at the morality play. Western kitchens argued. Some said the boy never had a chance the moment business learned how to borrow a badge. Some said he had too many chances, and still he reached for the rope that had been cut for him. Years later, other names would attach themselves to the legend. Men claiming to be the kid, old and living, men wanting to believe the tale could slip its grave as easily as its hero had slipped handcuffs. Myth is the part of history that cannot quit us. For Lincoln County, the reckoning wasn't a single body under a blanket. It was the slow unwinding of a monopoly's grip, the husbanding of ranches by widows like Susan McSween, who turned ledger scraps into deeds and became, in the mouths of neighbors, a cattle queen. It was the migration of certain men towards Santa Fe, where deals are cleaner in the telling even when they are not in the making. It was the gradual realization that a county can be forced to choose between law as a story and law as a system, and that when it chooses the story, it buys a generation of good yarns and a generation of shallow graves. And what of the boy himself, stripped of poster and epithet? He had a gift for friendship and a flaw for escalation. He was tender in kitchens and unflinching behind adobe. He shone where rooms were small and men were close, and the game required nerve more than weight. He believed, perhaps to the last night, that a clever man could still find a door in any room. It is not the worst creed to ride by. It is also not sufficient to stop a bullet. Garrett died years later on a lonely road, ambushed near the Organ Mountains. A symmetry historians pretend not to notice, and storytellers cannot leave alone. Wallace went back east with a book that made his name, and with a question that could not resolve itself. What would New Mexico have looked like if the paper he offered a youth in a lamplit bargain had become the protection he implied? We do not get to rerun our own histories. We make do with the consequences. Night returns quickly on the Pecos. The cottonwoods blacken, and the houses hunch down into their silhouettes again. The graveyard learns a new name and makes room for it alongside the old. A wind comes off the water and lifts the corner of a blanket on a clothesline, and for a second the gesture looks like a wave, a farewell between neighbors who will see each other again, because that is what neighbors do. The road from Lincoln to Fort Sumner is still there if you want to drive it, a quiet ribbon with dust that tastes like iron when a storm's coming. If you go, you won't find the boy. You will find a space in the air where he used to be, and the realization that the West we inherited is partly landscape and partly lesson. And the lesson is this: power keeps its books in ink, grief keeps its books in names. The Lincoln County War was a balance sheet written by both. If you want to understand why people still tell Billy's story, stand at dusk where the parade ground used to be and listen to the wind test the screen doors. Ask yourself which you would rather face: the law carried by men who owe favors, or the law carried by men who owe none. Ask yourself whether swagger is only a boy's way of refusing to be counted out. Then answer, if you can, the only question the tale ever really poses. When the dust rises in a county where credit buys the future and courage only rents the afternoon, what does justice look like? A badge? A bonfire? A shot in the dark? The Pecos doesn't say. It moves on, as it must, making a road of water for anyone stubborn enough to follow it.